There's a couple of cars that just about anyone can name, whether it's because of their pop culture appeal, their commercial success, or their association with important historical events. But in this video, we'll be looking at 3 lesser-known cars. Although not many people today can name these vehicles offhand, the impact these cars had was enormous and in some cases world-changing. The 1940 Oldsmobile Series 60 and 70. The Oldsmobile Series 60 and Series 70, which technically were 2 separate cars, hit the 1940 model year with an option which would change the way people drove for the next 80 years and counting. That may strike you as odd, seeing as these cars really weren't all that interesting on the face of it. They were sedans and coupes powered by a range of 6 and 8-cylinder engines from General Motors. They shared their platforms with their General Motors siblings Chevrolet, Pontiac, Buick, and Cadillac. But these Oldsmobiles had that one option which made them extremely important. These were the first mass-produced cars available with an automatic transmission. Now, if you've driven a car with a manual transmission at any time recently, you might be wondering what the big deal is. After all, it's pretty simple once you get the hang of it. But back in the 1930s, a manual transmission was a different beast altogether. Synchromesh, a mechanism which matches the speed of the engine and transmission between gear changes, was still in its infancy. This meant that the driver had to do it instead, usually through double clutching or timing their gear shifts to match the engine's speed. The latter obviously required lots of practice and familiarity with the car you happen to be driving. Although some cars, namely certain models of Cadillac, did have synchromesh on all gears, this was the exception rather than the norm. In general, driving a car in the pre-war years meant changing gears yourself, and often to the tune of an unforgiving transmission grinding and gnashing in response to your lack of skill. The whole thing was difficult enough to put many people off driving altogether. That changed permanently in the 1940 model year. On these cars, General Motors offered its newly developed fully automatic transmission. They called it Hydramatic. This transmission had 4 forward speeds and a reverse gear. As the name suggested, it used hydraulics to perform shifting, while a fluid coupling replaced a traditional clutch. The Hydramatic design went on to be deployed in everything from trucks to tanks in World War II. It was actually Cadillac which had done much of the legwork in designing and developing the automatic transmission, so why wasn't it offered on a Cadillac first? Well, it was such a radical and new idea that General Motors didn't want to risk Cadillac's reputation in case the new transmission went horribly wrong. Fortunately, that didn't happen. Following the example set by the Hydramatic, automatic transmissions became widely available, making driving accessible and appealing to millions of people who might have otherwise passed it over. The 1912 Cadillac Model 30. At the turn of the 20th century, cars had to be started by cranking a handle connected to the engine. You would turn over the engine, drawing fuel and air into the cylinders, until the distributor created a spark, hopefully igniting the mixture and spurring your engine into life. If all this sounds a bit precarious and dangerous, it was. Broken wrists and being run over by your own car were not unheard of. In fact, legend has it that a Cadillac engineer being killed during an accident while cranking over a car is what motivated the company to fit the Model 30 with an electric starter, the first production car to have one. Now, by itself, the fitment of an electric starter was a massive milestone in automotive history. But that wasn't all. Being fitted with an electric starter meant the Model 30 also needed a battery, which in turn was used to power the ignition and lighting. Before the Model 30, a car's headlights were typically powered by gas. And so, what the Model 30 really did was normalize the idea of a battery-powered electrical system built into a car. In the decades to come, 12-volt lead-acid batteries would become the standard found in just about every car you've ever been in. Today, just about everything you do inside a car involves the onboard electrical system: electric power steering, electric gear selectors, windows, door locks, power seats, navigation systems, and audio systems. All of these owe their existence to what the 1912 Cadillac Model 30 achieved. The 1914 Dodge Touring. Picture this. You're about to head to work in the morning. You're distracted by the radio, the cup of coffee you're holding, and the text messages popping up on your phone. You feel a slight bump and realize you've backed into a light pole. You'll need to visit a body shop and probably pay a deductible for your insurance. This will likely be an annoying and unwelcome surprise, but a little over 100 years ago, things would have been much, much worse. In the early 1900s, cars were typically made of wood. Some had moved to steel chassis, but the bodywork was made of timber or some intricate combination of steel framing and wooden panels. This coachwork, as it was called back then, was made by craftsmen who would usually spend years honing their skills. Even as mass production came into being, wooden car bodies still needed a great deal of care and attention. After all, timber had to be carefully acclimatized, sawn, chiseled, and carved to create the panels needed for an automobile. If you happened to damage some of that bodywork, getting it repaired was hardly as simple as pulling out the dent or welding in a replacement panel. Then there was the issue of preserving the wood. Wood required oils, varnishes, and sealers which needed to be applied and reapplied frequently. But in 1913, brothers John and Horace started a new car company called Dodge. The following year, they sold their first model, the 1914 Dodge touring car. It had a little over 30 horsepower and could reach a little over 60 miles per hour. Those weren't bad numbers for the day, especially not for Dodge's first outing. But what made the 1914 Dodge so significant was its bodywork. It was the first production car to feature an all-steel body. Steel was stronger, easier to repair, easier to preserve, and easier to craft into smooth, aerodynamic shapes. Now, steel bodywork wasn't an overnight change. For the next several decades, car manufacturers would phase out wooden coachwork. It would be reduced to a cosmetic role on certain steel-bodied vehicles, before being replaced with vinyl imitations and ultimately disappearing altogether. Today, genuine wood finishes are found as decorative elements in some luxury vehicles. For everything else, there's steel, and all of the convenience, durability, and safety it provides. Today we're accustomed to never having to refinish a brand new car after we've bought it, at least not for many years to come. We also take for granted the sleek, smooth lines that so many cars have today, a far cry from the boxy shapes of earlier cars. It was the 1914 Dodge touring car that paved the way for all of that. Well, those are three cars that most people have never heard of, but which played an enormous role in automotive history. Without them, the cars we drive and the way we drive them would likely be unrecognizable. If you enjoyed the video, consider liking and subscribing.